Hello and welcome. In this lecture, I will discuss in detail the political philosophy of Aristotle. Aristotle, the most famous Greek philosopher, was born in 384 BC in Stagira, which is in the northern Greece near the Macedonian border. His father, Nicomachus, was court physician of Amyntas III of Macedonia. During his early years, he might have been influenced by his father's profession and the aristocratic lifestyle in the king's palace. So it was expected that Aristotle will also take to his father's profession and thus enjoy a regal treatment in the king's palace. But soon this expectation became an illusion when he thought of joining Plato's academy in Athens to study philosophy. At the age of 17, he joined the academy, where he came in close and direct contact with Plato. Aristotle distinguished himself as Plato's most brilliant student. He sat under his feet as a serious and earnest student for 20 long years. Soon he became a favorite and trusted pupil of Plato, and it was widely believed that he would head the academy after Plato as his successor. However, in his later years, Aristotle had gradually begun to diverge and break away from the methodology and the philosophy of his teacher. After the death of Plato in 347 BC, instead of Aristotle, Plato's nephew Speusippus was chosen as the head of the academy. And moreover, when some of the devoted disciples at the academy wanted to deify Plato, Aristotle resisted any such attempt, as he strongly refused to consider any thinker beyond criticism. And in his mature works, he did freely criticize his teacher Plato and even his teacher's teacher Socrates. Thus, after the death of his teacher, he decided to leave not only the academy, but he also left the city of Athens. He went to Asia Minor and stayed in the court of his friend Hermias. He got married and a son was born, whom he named Nicomachus, after the name of his father. Aristotle was then invited by King Philip II of Macedonia to tutor his 13-year-old son Alexander, which he did for the next 5 years. He returned to Athens, which he had not visited since the death of Plato. He found that the Platonic school in Athens was flourishing under Xenocrates, and Platonism had become the dominant philosophy in Athens. He set up his own institution called the Lyceum. In establishing Lyceum, he was helped by Antipater, the viceroy of Alexander the Great in Athens. For 12 years, he personally headed this institution and compiled most of his famous works. But when, after the death of Alexander the Great, the Athenians revolted against the tyranny of Antipater, Aristotle had to flee Athens due to his proximity to Antipater. So he fled from Athens to escape prosecution. And he justified it by claiming that he did not wish to provide a chance to Athenians to commit another crime against philosophy, as they had done in the person of Socrates. He was clearly the kind of a realist who would rather take leave than take hemlock. Aristotle died only a year after this, in 322 BC, in Chalcis, at the age of 62 years. Aristotle's knowledge was encyclopedic. He wrote on ethics, metaphysics, art, poetry, economics, politics, physics, mechanics, physiology, medicine, astronomy, and logic. Aristotle was a prolific writer Many famous works in almost every domain of knowledge are attributed to him. Aristotle's political theory is found mainly in his work Politics. It consists of 8 books that deal with different aspects of a state. It is a systematic exposition of Aristotle's teleological views about the state, treason, and slavery. It also contains a comparative analysis of constitutions and an empirical study of causes and prevention of revolution in a state. Throughout the history of political thought, Aristotle is known as the first empirical thinker. He had a clear and verifiable approach to the problems which confronted him. He believed in the realistic and objective type of study. This realistic and empirical approach has made him immortal. Some of the modern thinkers are inclined to give him the title of father of political science, only because he employed comparative method to study 158 constitutions of his time and arrive at a scientific classification of constitutions. Aristotle pursued teleology to analyze and investigate political phenomena. He strongly believed that nature is a purposive system because there is teleology in nature. Teleology rests on 4 causes, which are material cause, efficient cause, the formal cause, and the final cause. As an explanation, Aristotle gives an analogy of a stone sculptor and identifies the 4 causes. Aristotle was the greatest pupil of Plato. The influence was so deep and lasting that he differed mainly in detail than in the fundamentals. Aristotle is known as the best and the first Platonist. Plato provided most of the philosophical content, which was refined and presented in a scientific and systematic manner by Aristotle. As a pupil, Aristotle never missed any opportunity of criticizing his tutor. Yet, it is a matter of fact that the fundamentals of his political philosophy are the same as those of Plato. The difference only arose because Aristotle was not a blind follower of Plato and was a realist rather than an idealist. Aristotle, as the father of political science, successfully integrated his views on politics in a systematic manner. By employing the methods of teleology, syllogism, and comparative analysis, he explained the origin and the ethical reason of the state. He defined citizenship, justified domestic slavery, and put forward a distributive view of justice. His major contribution is his classification of constitutions and the cycle of change. I will explain all of these one by one. Let me start with his views on the state. According to Aristotle, the state is the highest association of families and villages. It exists for the sake of a good life and not for the sake of life only. The human community is a complex interrelationship of 3 different kinds, the simplest of them evolving teleologically into more complex ones. The primary unit is the family or household. With the passage of time, various families unite to form a village that unites with other villages to form the polis. In historical terms, of course, the family and village are prior to the state, but in teleological terms, the opposite is the case. Teleologically, the state is the end towards which individual's social life ultimately aims. Since the state is the final end, other kinds of associations like family and village are subordinate to it and are simply stages leading ultimately to this most complete form of association. During the earlier 2 stages, individual's life is still incomplete. It is only when man becomes the member of the state that he attains full self-sufficiency. The state marks the final stage in the process of the natural growth. Hence, polis or state is natural to man. So, man is a political animal, zoon politikon, and polis is meant for man, not for gods and beasts. In other words, subhuman beings or beasts are too bad for the polis, and superhuman beings or gods are too good for it. Both are not natural like man. Further, Aristotle regards state as an organic association. In an organic unity, each organ performs a separate function and is dependent upon the whole to which it belongs for its life. The individuals who are part of the state are not only dependent upon it for their fullness of life, but Aristotle goes further to say that individuals are dependent upon the state for their very life. This he does with an analogy of human body and its organs to the state and its seasons. The individual is dependent upon the state as absolutely as a hand or a foot is dependent upon the body. He exists only in its life and has no meaning or existence except as sharing in its life. This syllogism leads Aristotle to the main conclusion that the state is prior to the individual. One thing is prior to another when it has first to be present to the consciousness. For example, a triangle is prior to the right angle. A circle is prior to a semicircle. They are the wholes which must be present to the consciousness for the definition of the parts. To define man, therefore, involves the prior idea of the state to which he is related as a part of a whole. The state is prior to the individual because the state is present to our consciousness as an idea before we think of the individual. Thus, the main characteristics of Aristotle's theory of state are: number one, the state is a natural association. It is the highest association of associations. It is only as a functional member of state that an individual attains self-sufficiency. The state is prior to individual. Now let us move on to know Aristotle's views on citizenship. Aristotle begins his inquiry into citizenship as a preliminary to understand the constitution of a state. According to Aristotle, to understand the constitution of a state, we must inquire into the nature of the state. To understand the nature of the state, we must examine the nature of citizenship, since state is a body of citizens. Residence cannot qualify a man for citizenship because both aliens and slaves share a common place of residence with citizens, though they are not citizens. Similarly, age cannot be a criterion for the young are not fit to be enrolled as citizens and the old superannuated enough to be excused of civic duties. So what constitutes citizenship is neither residence nor age but function. Aristotle regards the deliberative and judicial functions as the essential functions of the state. Accordingly, only those who perform these functions are the integral parts of the state, and as such, they are the only full and true citizens. Thus, the main qualifications for citizenship is the capacity to rule and be ruled in turn. Here, Aristotle justifies slavery, which was widespread in his times, and puts forward his own views to defend the institution of slavery. According to Aristotle, in order to function properly in the state, a citizen should be free from menial duties. A slave is engaged in rendering menial services to the household so that the citizen gets much required leisure. Though the slave is a human being, he is not a free man capable of leading a noble life because he is not a citizen. the master has an existence apart from being a master of the household. On the contrary, the slave has no life or activity apart from being a slave. He is bound to the household and is master and has no independent life of his own. The slave is merely an agent of action and not the agent of production, because as an animate instrument, he wholly belongs to his master as his property. Here Aristotle justifies slavery on natural grounds, that there is a natural inequality between men. As there is a natural rule of the superior over the inferior, the functions must be based on nature. It means that the function of ruling goes to the superior intellects, that is the citizens, while the function of physical labor must go to those who have good bodies but poor minds, that are the slaves. If the masters do not tyrannize over the slave, slavery is advantageous to both the master and the slave. Slavery is good because the slave gets the derivative virtues and excellence of his master. Aristotle advocates their emancipation as a reward of their acquired good behavior. Moreover, Aristotle defends only natural slavery, but not the slavery of prisoners of war as sanctioned by law. Free men, when captured in war, became slaves of the victor, and the law sanctions such a thing. Aristotle does not approve of this slavery. His views are that the Greek who are superior in virtue should not be enslaved. Only barbarians who are servile by nature can become slaves. Thus, being a conservative, Aristotle defends and justifies the then existing institution of slavery in Greece as natural and moral. After dealing with the citizenship and slavery, Aristotle puts forward his views of justice. According to Aristotle, justice is the highest virtue and the embodiment of all goodness. It is the very essence of a state, and no constitution can endure for a long time unless it is founded on the right scheme of justice. It is justice that makes a state, gives it a vision, and coupled with ethics, it takes the state to the heights of all ethical values. Justice saves the state from destruction. It makes the state and political life pure and healthy. For Aristotle, justice is either of a general connotation or it is of a particular connotation. In its general connotation, justice is complete virtue in action, and in its particular connotation, justice is distributive and proportionate. Aristotle looks at justice from the point of view of what democrats and oligarchs think. The democrats' belief in virtue is that men are born equal. So, equality in birth, that is, equality in one respect is equality in all respects. Hence, in the democratic view, equality is justice. Whereas, oligarchs believe that men are unequal in one respect, they are unequal in all respects. So, inequality is justice in the oligarchic view. But Aristotle disagrees with both the views and formulates his own view as justice is equal for equals and unequal for unequals. This view of Aristotle combines the democratic and oligarchic arguments when he held that in the distribution of goods, the ratio of the value of man's share to the value of man himself should be same for every man. Now, after discussing his views about justice, Aristotle presents his classification of constitutions. Aristotle, the father of political science, was the first political scientist to classify constitutions. It is believed that he studied as many as 158 constitutions that were prevalent in his time and offered a scientific and generally acceptable classification of constitutions. According to Aristotle, Constitution is an arrangement of political offices that effectively determines who shall be allowed to hold the political office. As state consists of citizens, and if every citizen is an office holder, then the constitution which determines the holding of office must determine the nature of state. Obviously, as we increase or decrease the number of office holders, the character of the state is also bound to alter. However, we may have two different states, each ruled by one person, but the quality of rule in one state may be quite different from that in the other. One person may rule to his own selfish advantage, while the other may rule to the public advantage. Consequently, Aristotle argues that the simplest and the most comprehensive classification of constitutions must involve two considerations, that is, the number of rulers and the quality of rule. The number of rulers as criterion of classification was earlier used by Plato also in his classification, but Aristotle introduced his criteria of quality of rule. It is serving of the common interest of the community or the selfish interest of the ruler that ultimately determines whether it is a normal constitution or the perverted one. Hence, Aristotle proposes a six-fold classification of constitutions, in which three are normal and three are perverted or bad. The three normal or good constitutions are monarchy, aristocracy, and polity. And the corresponding types of perverted constitutions are tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. So, Aristotle uses the criteria of the quantity, that is number of rulers, which can be one, few, or many, and the criteria of quality, that is the purpose of rule, which can be good or bad. This classification of Aristotle can be explained with the help of the following table. The first criterion is the number of rulers. The second criterion is the purpose of rule. If the ruler is one and he rules in the public interest, the constitution is normal and it may be called monarchy. But if the ruler is one and he rules in his own selfish interest, the constitution is perverted and it's called tyranny. Similarly, if the rulers are few of noble birth and they rule in the public interest, the constitution is aristocracy. But if they rule in their own selfish interest, the constitution is perverted and it transforms into oligarchy. Finally, if the rulers are many and they rule in the common interest, the constitution is polity. But if they rule in their own interest, the constitution is perverted and Aristotle calls it democracy. According to Aristotle, the best form of constitution is the polity. Here it is in place to mention that Aristotle did not consider Athenian democracy as normal, because it was not a democracy in its modern connotation that we have today. Here we move on to Aristotle's views on revolution. After classification of constitution in book 4 of Politics, Aristotle in book 5 considers the causes and prevention of destruction of constitution through revolutions. Aristotle finds the passion for equality as the general cause of all revolutions. Men think that they are the equals of those who have more than themselves and seek revolution to implement their desires, or feeling themselves superior, they seek to overturn a situation in which that superiority is not recognized. Thus, inferiors revolt in order that they may be equal, and equals revolt so that they may be superior. This is the state of mind that creates sedition which leads to revolution. There are other general causes of revolution also, which are: number 1, insolence and avarice of magistrates. Number 2, fear, force and fraud. Number 3, a disproportionate increase in the territory of the state. Number 4, polarization of the state into the rich and the poor. But in addition to the general causes, there is also a particular cause of revolution, which occurs when revolution is directed against the existing constitution, and its object is to change its nature, that is to turn aristocracy into oligarchy or oligarchy into polity. Revolutions tend to be caused by the policy of demagogues. By attacking the rich are compelled to combine together against democracy to turn it into oligarchy. Similarly, in aristocracies, revolutions are due to policy of narrowing down the circle of office bearers to a smaller number. Thus, instability in the constitutions occur due to perversion from good to bad or vice versa. An important feature of Aristotle's classification is his argument that none of the forms of constitution is of permanent nature. Neither a good normal constitution can last long, nor is a bad perverted constitution tolerated by people for a long time. He concludes that a cycle of political change is constantly going on. Finally, Aristotle concludes his political discourse by emphasizing observance of the golden mean or moderation that ensures constitutional stability. That's all for now. Goodbye, and thank you very much for being with me.